Judge Hendel would.
Who's now studying at Bar Ilan. When he was 3 or 4 years old, it was Tisha B'Av, and I said Echa in the shul, and people said Yesh Koach and so forth, and he was very quiet, and I said to him, what do you think of the way I said Echa? And he said, you know, your voice is okay, but you really don't know Hebrew. Now, since no one corrected me and I was just reading a parak that someone else wrote, I assumed he was referring to my accent. I was annoyed a little bit. My American accent was heavier then in Hebrew. I was annoyed a little bit, and I said, do you know what I do for a living? At the time, I was a prosecutor. And he thought, and he said, do you work in English? So now he's going to see that I continue to work in English here. In terms of what Abraham said, I'll just very briefly say that's exactly the kind of approach that I was speaking of. I think it's very, very important that halacha deal with this issue with the seriousness that it deserves. Rav Soloveitchik said that there's a 614th commandment, which is that one must believe that halacha has the tools to deal with any situation at any time and any place. And that's also connected with a lot of the things that are happening in Bar Ilan, that there's a serious, not a superficial, a very serious attempt to deal with issues, whether it's in law and psychology and technology and so forth. And this is in itself, it's something that's very important that has to be done. It's interesting because, as Rav Avram pointed out, legal systems try to create new categories. And that's why the solution, I believe, that most legal systems would give to it would not be theft, but rather would try and give it this type of action a new name. Halacha, because it so treasures precedent, would try and expand the pre-existing concept, which is exactly what has happened here. And this is perhaps the most extreme example of Gnevat Da'at. And also, even though this case is very theoretical, perhaps one of the interesting things about thinking about it in that way is that we perhaps should take the concept of Gnevat Da'at much, much more seriously in our daily lives and in our connections with other people.
Yeah, I would like to comment, though, and tell my panelists how this would be handled, or a similar case was handled by the Ethics Committee, and see what your reaction to that is. We, of course, never had a case like this, but on 2 occasions at Columbia, we had the issue of post-mortem sperm removal raised, where a wife, in one case, the patient was not yet dead, but he was dying, and the wife wanted his sperm taken from him. He could not give consent so that it would be frozen, and in that case she actually wanted it because should one of their existing children ever have a disease that she would need bone marrow transplant for, she could take it from the child, because one of their children, I think, had cancer in the past. The other case was in a situation of a man who had a devastating stroke, a brainstem stroke, following a heart bypass operation, and the patient was alive. He and his wife were undergoing fertility treatments at the time because she could not get pregnant, but she had not gotten pregnant, and she felt he was probably going to die, and she wanted his sperm for the purposes of conceiving a child that they had wanted to conceive prior to his having the operation and the stroke. It was very dramatic, actually. We went into his room and we tried to communicate with him through his blinking his eyes. He had a brainstem stroke, a locked-in syndrome, and we went in with 2 lawyers to see if we could obtain his consent to this question, and the man actually died as we approached him. It was if it were on television, you would turn the channel and say, this is too corny. At any rate, in both cases, we decided not to grant the wish of the wife, pure and simple because it was felt that we would not do this without the consent of the man, that for a person to father a child, even in a case where the father was clearly interested in fathering a child when he was well, we could not assume that this would be his wishes after his death, and therefore something of the enormity of fathering a child we could not carry out without the consent. of the father. And the only way in which our assisted reproductive technology people at Columbia would do it is if they actually had some written testimony prior that the patient would say, in case of my death, I give permission for my sperm to be removed for the purposes of fertility. I'd like to know the thoughts of my panelists on that.
It's an interesting question because the issue has come up in a different variant in Israeli law where a soldier, after he died, you have a period of 72 hours where you can remove the sperm, and there was his girlfriend wished to remove his sperm. There's a lot of talk about this, actually, that the judge who handled the case said that we don't have to assume that that only a wife could request this. We also should ask the parents. We also can assume that he would have wanted this. I think the result was very incorrect to my way of thinking for several reasons. First of all, I think if the issue of consent is important, you should receive consent. I'm not sure. I'm sorry?
So what was the result in this case?
The result was they said that you could remove the sperm in that particular case. It didn't go up to a higher court. It was a local family court. It didn't go up higher. And I think it's unfortunate these questions are not, it's interesting that sometimes when you have an ethics committee, they can be stricter than a court. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know. These raises other questions. I don't know whether consent is always the primary factor. I think we sometimes exaggerate the importance of consent. Just to take this example of becoming a father after death, Rav Aviner said that there are instances where someone is a yatom, and it's very, very tragic, and we relate to a yatom, someone who's an orphan, who doesn't have both parents, as something very tragic. Why should we, to begin with, set up a situation like that? What I'm trying to suggest is the questions are very, very profound regarding whether we want to do this to a child. A child should be born in this way. Legally, the arguments are very strong. Someone made the argument in that case, it's better this way because now we know who the donor is, and the child can have grandparents and uncles and so forth. Just how clever lawyers can be. They turn this, what I think is a disadvantage, into an advantage. I don't know, again, I think consent should be clear. I wonder, it's similar question, the autopsy questions, whether consent is as critical as it seems. It may be a condition, it may not be the only condition. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't matter. Modern law takes the approach that we not only have to ask the deceased, but also his wife, also his parents. These are good rules. I don't know, because we're at a point where this area of law is just developing, and we should be more careful. I don't know whether inherently it's relevant. In other words, I don't know if a person wants to do this and it's allowed and it should be done, whether the fact that his parents don't want to do it should be relevant at all. But we're very, very careful about that. But I see that as really a different kind of area, which really relates to the question of in this case, perhaps you could assume that he would want to help his child if it's limited to that kind of situation, and you do not have the autopsy problems. And it may be that for this kind of example, because you're talking about something very specific, you're not talking about creating a new life, but you're talking about having a situation where you can help the child, where the assumption might be, I might, if I heard a case like that, be interested in hearing evidence to somehow overcome the fact that he didn't have, in the second story where it was very dramatic, where he couldn't really blink his eyes in time to say it. I might want to perhaps receive the consent from the circumstances surrounding it.
Yeah. Would you apply the issue of genevat dat in general to a post-mortem sperm retrieval in a circumstance where you had no idea of the wishes of the, say, father, and the wife said, I want my husband's sperm to get pregnant with, and we had no idea of the wishes of the father? Would you use the principle of genevat dat there and not take the sperm?
טוב, זאת כבר שאלה אחרת. בקשר לשאלה, אני אתחיל עם השאלה הראשונה. בקשר לשאלה הראשונה, דווקא התחושה שלי שאני לא רואה למה לא לעשות את זה. צריך להבחין פה כמובן בין כמה אספקטים. יש את האספקט של הפגיעה בזכותו של האבא, שעומד להיפטר מן העולם, ויש את הפגיעה בילד העתידי. במובן המשפטי הטהור, פגיעה בילד עתידי זה לא אישו, כי הוא עדיין לא נמצא כאן. זה כמו מה שקוראים, נדמה לי לפחות, מה שקוראים משפטנים הולדה בעוולה. הולדה בעוולה זה מצב שבו ילד תובע את הוריו, או לא משנה, את הרופא שייעץ להוריו, למה הם הביאו אותו לעולם. הוא היה רוצה לא להיות פה. מוטב לו לאדם משלא נברא. אז לכן אני לא חושב שהוא בכלל נמצא כאן, לפחות ברובד הפורמלי, הוא נמצא כאן כמישהו שהוא צד בעניין. בקשר לאבא, אם האבא הראה רצון ברור לעשות את זה, כי בסך הכל הוא עשה את המאמצים עם אשתו, אז מה הבעיה בזה? אז אני לא רואה, למה לא להניח שאם הוא מסכים, אז אפשר לעשות?
אבל הוא היה בחיים, אז אנחנו לא יודעים מה שהוא היה רוצה לעשות אם הוא היה נפטר.
הוא עשה את המאמצים לפני שהוא ידע שהוא במצב סופני?
כן.
אז זה אולי, חשבתי שהוא כבר עשה את זה תוך כדי בגלל זה. אז זה באמת שאלה יותר קשה כבר. אז זה כבר שאלה יותר קשה, למרות שעדיין, אני לא חושב שאם אנחנו עושים אומדנה במקום, הרי בסך הכל מה שאנחנו יכולים לעשות, אנחנו יכולים להיכנס לראשו של האבא, מה האדם הסביר במצב כזה היה אומר. ואני חושב שהאדם הסביר במצב כזה כן היה רוצה לשתף פעולה עם אשתו, אבל פה באמת זו שאלה יותר של פשוט לבדוק ולראות. אני לא חושב שזאת קטגוריה חדה, הלכתית או משפטית חדה. צריך לראות, אם האדם הסביר היה מעוניין בדבר כזה, אני לא רואה שום מניעה לעשות את זה. בקשר למושג של גניבת דעת, הוא כמובן נגזר מן העניין הזה. ברגע שאנחנו מגיעים למסקנה שאי אפשר לעשות את זה, אז זה הופך להיות גניבת דעת. אבל זה לא מתחיל מהגניבת דעת. אנחנו מתחילים מהשאלה, כי אנחנו צריכים להראות שבאמת הבן אדם לא רוצה לתת את הדעת הזאת. ואז זה נקרא שגנבת ממנו. אחרת, אם הוא מוכן לתת את הדעת הזאת, אז לקח את הדעת ברשות. אז
It would appear that the absence of an opinion by the father in all these cases is equivalent to a negative opinion. That's also an assumption that we don't have any basis to make. Why should we assume negative? Why should we assume positive? Assume there's no ta'ana at all to the father. Then the only ta'ana that's before us is the mother's.
Well, if I have to justify the ethics committee, I will. I will say that the default position before you do something invasive and proactive to somebody, the default position is not to do it. We need permission to do something. We don't assume that the person will allow us to cut him and take the sperm, etc. We need something positive in that respect. Rabbi.
2 points. One point is, if we assume that it is gnivat da'at, so the default point would be, even if it was not invasive, even if I had a tissue already, some kind of a tissue already, or sperm in the sperm bank already, if I say it's gnivat da'at, you have to prove that you have the right to take it. Otherwise, you have the right to take it. So, Adam Savir, the reasonable person, is not enough proof to say that they agreed to give. This is one point. Second point is about the whole issue of gnivat da'at. What happens if I don't want to have a child? I just want to scan the genetic material. I also retrieve the information hidden in the tissue. Now, we scatter our DNA all over. We use here people that sit here in the panel, left some DNA on the table, you leave it all over. I don't think you can say that something that you live all over the world, it's isur gnivat da'at in any way to retrieve it and scan it and see what information it contains. The whole prohibition is to have a child, and this is the issue. Now, I don't see that the having a child has anything to do with gneva if you remove the tort, the element of tort from that. Because the gneva means I obtain something, I obtain information. Now, the use that I do with the information has nothing to do with gneva. And if the information is readily available, then having the child is the problem because of the tort, because of the problem that they cause the father by burdening him with a child is not leading to one.
Would you like to comment?
כאן אני לא מסכים. אני חושב שהטענה שהמידע הזה הוא נגיש ופרוץ, היא לכל היותר, היא לא מערערת על עצם הטענה של גניבת דעת, אלא היא לכל היותר יכולה לבוא במישור של כמו זוטו של ים, או משהו שכבר פרוץ לכל אחד, אז ממילא אין לך זכויות עליו, או שלא אכפת לך. כל זה לא מערער את עצם הטענה של גניבת דעת, אתה רק אומר שאין פה גניבה. בגלל שהבן אדם לוקח את זה, או כי זה כבר נלקח ממני, או כי אני מסכים. אבל זה לא מערער את הקונספציה של גניבת דעת. אז פה צריך לדון בכל דבר לגופו, יכול להיות שזה נכון.
I would like to raise one point. I'm not an expert in evolution or animal behavior, but according to my intuition, it seems that unlike any other information, there is a very strong tendency of males to spread the genetic characteristics. If you look in the nature, males would fight and struggle and do anything to spread the genetic information. So I would say the basic tendency of a male is to spread the genetic information. You can see it from nature.
That's because they like how it's done. It's because they like how it's done.
That's one of the programs. One of the programs in nature to drive males to spread this is one of the, of course, of the motivations. But I think it is an inherent characteristic in nature for male to spread the genetic information. Now, I think we as human beings are very much reserved because we have some other factors raising the point of responsibilities and the outcome of responsibility, things like that. It might well be that the basic tendency, if we remove the whole point of responsibility, is that the initial motivation is to spread this information to give the sperm. So maybe unlike other kind of information, in this case, we have to prove that the owner would refuse to give away the information. The default situation is that the owner tends to spread the genetic material information. This is our basic evolutionary characteristic, and I think we are just halted, reserved by fears for responsibilities. How should we take care of all the offspring? Animals that don't have any fear of responsibility, they would fight and do anything to spread the genetic information.
Professor Goldstein.
I would like to take issue with what Rappaport said in terms of it not being gnevat da'at, just to take the information. There's also in America, was mentioned I think yesterday or today, and also in Israel, very strong laws preventing identifying people through their DNA. If you give tissue samples, pathological samples that are banked in a hospital, you're absolutely not allowed to know about the identity of the person. If someone were to take the glasses here from the days and take DNA from these glasses and then do a DNA sequencing and then sell it to a biotechnological company or to your insurance company, this would definitely be gnevat da'at, and the information itself is something that you would certainly, even if you haven't lost anything, you have saliva that you left in the glass, it's most certainly something wrong there. I mean, not even Yakar, I think it's gnevat da'at, the way Rabbi Abraham defined it. And I think it's very clear that genetic information is something
It's a privacy.
private, value, I don't know what you want to say.
I would just, to elaborate on that point, and it connects with Rav Shabtai's point, the question that you asked me while I was speaking, whether you look at it from the beginning or from the result. In Bava Batras, or the Meiri talks about the fact that, it talks about Hezek Riya, and he gives of a damage of seeing something. So he talks about the fact that the walls are not very strong and you can hear things. He calls it Hezek Shmiya, that there's a damage because you're hearing something. I brought this actually in a wiretapping case. And it seems to me that if we talk about a situation where some information is very easy to receive, assuming an example that I have super hearing and I can hear everything that everyone says, or I can see into a building, or you think of recently about Matovo Alecha Yaakov, that the openings of the tents didn't face each other. It would seem that there's ample support in Judaism that just because something is very accessible and very easy to get to does not in itself make it an action which should be approved of. So again, if we take even a more simple example than was raised, so I touch this cup, I'm leaving the cup here, so in some sense anybody can take it, and someone receives it for his own interest. He wants to know how healthy I am, and he wants to know more about my health. Let's say he could. So it would seem that should not be allowed. on the assumption that it's clear that he's invading my privacy in a similar sense of Hezek Riyah and Hezek Shmiyah, it could be because it's so accessible that the reason for the Yisur should be changed. I'm willing to accept the point that the Rav Shaftai made, but to say that there's nothing wrong with that since I left the cup, and I plan to leave the cup even though I know that someone could do this. I don't plan to walk around all the time collecting the garbage everywhere, should be something that should be taken into account. There actually was an American Supreme Court which talked about the fact that people can't go through your garbage. Even though, because there you'll find more about a person than anywhere else. If you want to know the most about a person, go through his garbage. Well, the garbage I threw out, it's accessible. I'm not keeping my garbage. So again, I would think it's important in this category to develop the sense of Jewish privacy, and I think the sources are all there. It could be, as I say, the basis for the Yisur is different, but I think we should be clear that it shouldn't be done.
Yes, sir.
Would it make any difference?
Speak up, please.
Would it make any difference if the grandfather in this case, instead of being a charismatic Hasidic Rebbe, was a mass murderer? Remember the story of the boys from Brazil where they took Hitler's sperm, whatever, and they made a whole bunch of clones from him. Would the decision go differently if there were negative long-term evolutionary implications rather than positive?
Well, which decision are you referring to? You said, would the decision go differently?
Well, whether or not it would be allowed for this mole to take the Orlov for his own purpose.
Oh, I think what you heard was that if the woman wanted to carry the pregnancy to term, she has a right to do so. I think that's my understanding. We would not force her. And if he were a mass murderer and she wanted to have the child, I'm not sure that would change, although I'd let the panelists discuss that. And the issue of the stealing, still it becomes, I don't see that act changing, the illegality of it changing because of the nature of who the person was. But I invite the panelists to comment on that. Would that make any difference at all?
There is an example in the Gemara, I forget about who it said, is it about Chizkiyahu? I don't recall, where they said that he didn't have children precisely because of the fact that he knew that his children...
Yeah, I think you have to talk in the
I'm
mic.
sorry, where somebody did not have children because he knew through divine awareness that the children would be evil, and that wasn't his consideration to take. It's a broader question whether Chizkiyahu, yes, as I said, Chizkiyahu, that wasn't recognized. So I don't know whether it would change the question really. We believe in free will and that the Rasha can give birth to a tzaddik and the tzaddik can give birth to a Rasha, and unfortunately there are enough examples of both. So I don't think that in itself would change the question. When people want to have children, we're not necessarily looking at it in terms of a long-term effect on the evolutionary development of mankind.
Professor Sperber?
I just wanted to say that if I had an appendicitis and they operated on me, and then the doctor took away the bits that they took out of me and gave it to his daughter, and then a few years later I was told I'm responsible for some child, I would be absolutely shocked.
Would you be angry or just shocked?
I would be furious.
You would be furious. I would wish you had said that. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to set the record straight.
Right.
Okay.
To clarify the emotional
Right,
state.
not just, right. Yes,
Shock
John.
doesn't
Yeah, no.
want more information.
Sorry.
In halacha, is there any consideration of the responsibility of a father, whether it's donating sperm or inappropriately giving cells, the responsibility to be a father? Is it willy-nilly that you could just say, okay, I'm just going to donate sperm and not care about responsibilities of raising this child?
זה מה שאמרתי קודם, שאם באמת אנחנו מכירים בבן, בתור הבן שלי, של הדונור, זאת אומרת של מי שתורם את הזרע, אז לכאורה צריכות להיות לי גם המחויבויות כלפיו. זאת השאלה בדיוק. או שלא, או שהוא לא הבן שלי, זה דעת מיעוט נדמה לי בין הפוסקים, ואז אין מחויבויות, אבל זה מתחיל בשאלה אם הוא הבן שלי, אין לנתק את השאלות האלה.
What is your conclusion?
There is no conclusion. Not for me.
In most of the secular cases, the conclusion is that it is the father, and if we assume it's the father, then the son would have to respect the father, and the father would have to do his obligations. It's also, it would seem to me that we would prefer a situation where a child is not fatherless, And so if he's not the father, it means he's born of, he has a mother but not a father, and that would also raise certain
But
questions.
practically, it's not gonna happen. They're both gonna be of age where there's no responsibility.
Yes, but assuming he is the father, would he have to lechabed oto? I don't want to take this too, would the ben have to lechabed oto? It seems to me he would lechabed oto. If we reverse your question, say, does he have the obligation of the fifth commandment to respect his father? He would have to respect his father. In fact, he's standing up in the room for someone that's the same age. It's a different problem. You know, you might have those problems in the days of Tchiyat HaMetim. I don't know. I don't want to quite get there. It could actually be could occur. But
How would that work in the garden?
what? How it would work in the God, yes. Well, he would have to let him sit first, I guess.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I preface my remarks to say, I don't know if I'm the only one. I have such tremendous pleasure to hear a judge in the Supreme Court of Israel quote the Marah quite frequently, and I suspect that that's a rather unusual skill in that institution. Now, therefore, let me do some, although I mean, Talmid, Ben Harabahim Shali, I have one item in the Torah that wasn't cited, that may be quite relevant to clarify the issue. There's a mitzvah aseh, a positive mitzvah of Ashavat Evedah. Ashavat Gzeilah. We learn a lot from that. Chazal tell us that the Gazlan, or the Ganav, doesn't receive malkol. He wouldn't be sentenced to a long prison term, in modern terms, because lav hanitat la'aseh. Aseh, to return the. On the other hand, even if the stolen item is no longer existing, he consumed it, he's obligated to compensate the person from whom he stole. Now, perhaps we have a completely separate issue if we're talking about the case in point, Gnevat, identity theft. How can you, where's Hashavat Zayla? How can you return that? The DNA that was taken from the Orla, how can you return it?
Okay.
It
Would you
doesn't
like
have
to-
a financial value that you can give to somebody who was injured by this. So, therefore, maybe if we call this a different issue, X, first of all, is it an Isur, like Neva? Well, here, if you say there's no Hashavat Avedah, then he's subject to Malkot. Only because we say it's Zaylah, he's
I must interrupt in the interest of time because you have a long question. But let us have just an answer to the beginning of your question. Would you like to?
וגם בגזלה, המחויבות הבסיסית היא להחזיר את החפץ שאותו גזלו. ואם אין לי אותו, צריך להחזיר במקום זה ממון, נכון? עכשיו גם פה אותה שאלה, ובשאלה הזאת הפוסקים עסקו הרבה, פה אפילו לא צריך להגיע לקונסטרוקציות של גנבת דעת. השאלה איך אפשר, מה היסוד של חובת הפיצוי במקום שאתה פוגע בקניין רוחני? אז אם אתה מאמץ את אחד המכניזמים של הפוסקים שאומרים אתה צריך תשלומי הנאה או בגלל שזה חסר או בגלל שאני נהנה, זה תלוי איך מסתכלים על זה, אז גם פה תהיה חובת פיצוי באותה צורה. זה לא קשור לשאלה של האיסור בהכרח. השאלה האם הגניבה הזאת עצמה מחייבת השבה, זה קשור קצת לקהילות יעקב שהזכרתי בסוף, אבל זה... זה כבר תלוי אם התפיסה היא שהלא תגזול אין בכלל מלכות, בגלל שבאופן הרגיל יש מצוות השבה, אז גם כשאין מצוות השבה אין מלכות. זה מחלוקת בין האחרונים, אבל זה...
Just very quickly to add to what Rav Avram said about Hashavat Evedah, it's an interesting example of what I was trying to talk about, how a concept could be expanded. As is known, the Rambam, unlike many poskim, doesn't learn that you have the right for a doctor to practice medicine from V'rapo Yurapeh that you should heal, but he learns it from Vashavat Avedah, that you return to the person's health. V'rapo Yurapeh, he learns that the physician can make money. So he's allowed to get paid even though he's doing a mitzvah. So it's an example, these categories can be quite broad. About the question of punishment, since I was asked about that, I'll just say this very quickly. It's one of the interesting issues, but I'll just say this, that there's a letter in Rav Herzog's book where he talks about a conversation he had with Rav Chaim Ozer, where Rav Herzog was trying to bring about the result that Israeli law would be according to Jewish law. And that would raise many questions. And Rav Chaim Ozer said that it's true that if the thief returns the property, then he just doesn't really have any punishment. And he said that if we're going to create a state where it's so easy, once the thief is caught, he says, 1 second, I want to return the property and then I'll go away from punishment. He said, then perhaps we have to think of new punishments in light of that reality. So I just mentioned that when you're talking about punishments, in a modern state where certain crimes are very common, even from a halakhic point of view, the question is more complicated than it might seem at first instance.